The Pacific Ocean off the southern coast of Mexico widens quickly. Beyond the beaches of Chiapas, the continental shelf falls away and the water deepens. The color shifts from green to a darker blue. Fishing boats leave before dawn and return by afternoon, tracing familiar paths along currents that move steadily west and south. This stretch of ocean forms part of the eastern Pacific Basin. Seasonal winds shape its surface. From May through November, warm water feeds tropical systems that gather strength far offshore. Storms are common during these months, though most remain distant from the coast. The sea appears manageable until weather alters it. Small fishing communities line the shoreline. Costa Azul is one of them. It is not large. Boats are pulled onto sand or anchored near estuaries. Work depends on the daily catch: shark, tuna, sailfish. Men leave in fiberglass skiffs fitted with outboard motors. The vessels are narrow and open, designed for speed rather than distance. Once beyond sight of land, the horizon forms a clean circle. There are no markers, no fixed reference points. The sky meets water in a thin line that remains unchanged hour after hour. Currents in this region move westward. They connect Mexico to the vast interior of the Pacific. Objects carried into them do not return quickly. From shore, the ocean appears finite. From within it, there is no visible boundary. From the beach at Costa Azul, José Salvador Alvarenga worked as he had for years. He was born in 1975 in Garita Palmera, El Salvador, a coastal village near the border with Guatemala. The region relied on fishing and small-scale agriculture. As a young man, Alvarenga learned to work boats and nets in estuaries and nearshore waters. In the late 1990s, like many others from Central America, he left El Salvador. Economic instability and limited opportunity pushed many northward. He settled in Mexico, eventually reaching the state of Chiapas. By the early 2000s, he had become a familiar presence in Costa Azul. He worked as a deep-sea fisherman, often hired for multi-day trips targeting shark and other large species. He was known locally for endurance. Fellow fishermen later described him as comfortable in open water and willing to take long shifts. His experience was practical rather than formal. He did not navigate by instrument alone. He read wind direction, swell movement, and bird patterns. The work required physical resilience and tolerance for uncertainty. Alvarenga lived modestly. He had a daughter in El Salvador, born in the early 2000s. He sent money home when he could. His routine was seasonal. During productive months, boats left regularly. Income fluctuated with weather and catch size. Risk was accepted as part of employment. In November 2012, the fishing season was still active. Weather forecasts indicated unstable conditions offshore, but short-term trips continued. On November 17th, Alvarenga agreed to crew a 25-foot fiberglass skiff owned by a local fisherman. The vessel was open, with no cabin. It carried a single outboard motor, a large icebox for storing catch, fuel, fishing lines, hooks, and basic communication equipment, including a two-way radio and a GPS device. Originally, another experienced fisherman was scheduled to accompany him. That individual withdrew at the last moment, reportedly due to concerns about approaching weather. In his place, a young man named Ezequiel Cordoba joined the trip. Cordoba was approximately in his early 20s. Accounts vary slightly on his exact age. He had limited offshore experience compared to Alvarenga. The journey was intended to last roughly 30 hours. They planned to travel several dozen miles from shore to check long lines set for shark. The departure did not suggest extraordinary risk. Small crews routinely left under similar conditions. The boat was provisioned primarily for work, not extended travel. It carried no dedicated life raft. There were no emergency beacons beyond standard radio communication. Such limitations were common in artisanal fishing operations along that coast. The arrangement reflected economic pressure. Each trip represented potential income. Missed days meant lost earnings. Alvarenga had completed many similar outings before. Nothing in his history suggested recklessness. He operated within the norms of the region's fishing industry. Shortly after departure, the coastline receded behind them. The skiff moved south and west into open water. They set lines and began collecting fish. At that stage, the trip followed a familiar pattern. By the afternoon of November 17, 2012, weather conditions had shifted. Wind intensified beyond forecast levels. Swells built in irregular patterns. The skiff, already loaded with catch, rode lower in the water. Rain reduced visibility. According to later accounts given by Alvarenga, the outboard motor began to fail during the storm. The propeller reportedly became entangled with fishing gear or debris. The engine eventually stopped functioning. They attempted to restart it. The effort failed. Alvarenga used the radio to contact a colleague on shore. He reported mechanical trouble and worsening weather. Coordinates were transmitted. The response indicated that assistance would be attempted once conditions allowed. However, the storm strengthened. Waves rose high enough to obscure the horizon. The boat, without engine power, lost directional control. The anchor could not secure them in deep water. The skiff began to drift. During the night, communication weakened. Eventually, radio contact was lost. Heavy rain filled the vessel, faster than it could be bailed. They discarded equipment and portions of their catch to reduce weight. The GPS unit later ceased functioning, likely due to water exposure. Without propulsion or reliable navigation, they moved with prevailing currents. Search efforts were initiated from shore when the boat did not return as scheduled. Local fishermen and authorities scanned the coastal area. The search radius remained relatively close to Mexico's shoreline. Strong currents, however, were already carrying the disabled skiff westward into the open Pacific. Within days, land disappeared entirely from view. The distance between them and shore increased without measurement. Fuel was irrelevant. The engine was unusable. There was no sail, no secondary motor. The boat no longer belonged to a fishing route. It had entered the current. The first days were governed by expectation. Alvarenga believed search boats might appear. Aircraft were possible. The Mexican Coast Guard had conducted rescues before. He and Cordoba remained alert to distant engine noise. None came. Fresh water was the immediate concern. The skiff had not been stocked for extended travel. Ice stored with the catch melted quickly in the heat. Rain, however, continued intermittently in the early phase of their drift. Alvarenga used available containers, the large ice box, plastic fuel containers once emptied, and even the hull's recesses, to collect and store rainwater. Clothing and plastic sheeting were arranged to funnel runoff. When rain stopped for extended periods, dehydration intensified. In those intervals, they consumed small amounts of turtle blood or their own urine, a practice documented in maritime survival cases. Rain remained their primary source of hydration. Without it, survival would have been brief. Food was more accessible. The ocean provided it, though not in prepared form. Fish gathered beneath floating objects, including their own boat. Using remaining hooks and lines and at times simply grasping with hands, Alvarenga caught small fish, triggerfish, mahi-mahi, and others drawn to shade. They ate the flesh raw. There was no fire. Sun-drying occurred occasionally, but most consumption was immediate. Sea turtles became a critical resource. When turtles surfaced near the skiff, Alvarenga pulled them aboard. The animals provided meat and blood. He consumed nearly every part except the shell. Seabirds also landed periodically on the boat's edges. They were captured by hand when possible. The routine stabilized around necessity. Mornings were used to check lines and scan the horizon. Midday heat required stillness to conserve energy. The fiberglass hull amplified sunlight. There was little shade beyond the icebox lid. Clothing deteriorated under constant exposure to salt water and sun. Salt sores developed on their skin. Hands cracked, lips split. Alvarenga later reported that he attempted to keep Cordoba engaged in simple tasks, collecting water, cleaning fish, adjusting lines. Structured activity reduced panic. Days were counted at first, marked mentally by sunrise and sunset. Without fixed reference points, time gradually blurred. They drifted along currents later identified as part of the North Equatorial Current System. The path moved westward across the Pacific Basin. Cargo ships crossed distant routes, but none came near enough to see the low-profile skiff. On several occasions, according to Alvarenga's later testimony, large vessels were visible at extreme distance. He attempted to signal using reflective surfaces and waving. There was no response. Storm systems passed intermittently. During heavy weather, survival required holding onto the hull to prevent being swept overboard. The boat shipped water repeatedly. Bailing was constant work. Lightning illuminated the sea at night. There was no anchor point in deep water, only drift. Months passed. The body adapts to raw protein when necessary. Historical documentation from medical examinations after rescue indicated that Alvarenga maintained enough caloric intake to avoid immediate organ failure. He lost significant weight, but did not reach a skeletal state. Regular access to fish and turtle likely prevented starvation in its most extreme form. Psychological adaptation was less measurable. Alvarenga later stated that he spoke aloud to maintain orientation. He reported recalling family members and imagining future meetings. There is no independent verification of his internal experience beyond his own account, but extended isolation is known to alter perception. He constructed markers in his mind: new moons, estimated months, remembered holidays. The skiff accumulated debris. Barnacles attached below the waterline. Fish circled continuously. The boat became a moving reef. At some stage, during the drift, a plastic container and other floating items were retrieved from the sea. These provided additional storage for rainwater. Improvisation was constant but limited by available material. The icebox served as both seat and shelter. When rain was heavy, they lay inside briefly to reduce exposure. There was no navigation beyond observation of sun position. They did not possess charts capable of oceanic plotting. Alvarenga later said he assumed currents might eventually bring them toward land somewhere west. This assumption aligned with general Pacific circulation patterns, though he had no precise knowledge of distance. The Pacific Basin spans thousands of miles between Mexico and the nearest island chains. The drift was not direct or linear. Currents vary seasonally. It is estimated, based on oceanographic modeling conducted after his rescue, that the skiff moved gradually west-southwest, carried by prevailing flow. Food procurement continued daily. When fish were scarce, hunger sharpened. When turtles appeared, consumption increased. Waste was discarded overboard immediately to avoid contamination. The absence of cooking fire meant constant ingestion of raw tissue. This posed risks of parasites and infection, though prolonged saltwater exposure may have limited some pathogens. Hydration cycles defined survival. Periods of rainfall restored strength. Dry intervals weakened them. Tropical sun produced intense evaporation. Their skin darkened and thickened. Nails grew irregularly. Hair lengthened unchecked. The early expectation of rescue diminished gradually. There was no single moment when hope ended. Instead, it reduced incrementally as weeks passed without sign of search vessels. The skiff crossed open ocean with no external acknowledgement. Routine replaced anticipation. Wake at dawn. Check lines. Search sky for clouds. Conserve energy at midday. Fish when able. Collect rain if present. Sleep in intervals. As the drift extended into its fourth month, differences between the two men became more pronounced. Cordoba was younger and less accustomed to prolonged exposure at sea. Reports based on Alvarenga's later testimony indicate that Cordoba struggled to accept the consumption of raw animals. He reportedly expressed distress at eating turtles and birds without cooking. Over time, his food intake declined. Reduced caloric intake accelerated weakness. Physical deterioration followed. Without consistent nourishment, muscle mass decreases. Immune response weakens. Exposure to salt water and sun compounds stress. According to Alvarenga's account, Cordoba became increasingly withdrawn. He spent longer periods lying in the boat without speaking. Rainfall patterns fluctuated during this period. Dehydration may have contributed to confusion and lethargy. There is limited independent documentation of Cordoba's exact symptoms, as only Alvarenga survived to describe them. However, medical understanding of starvation and exposure aligns with the general description he later provided. At some point approximately 4 months into the drift, estimated around March 2013, Cordoba stopped eating entirely. Alvarenga attempted to persuade him to continue consuming fish and turtle meat. There is no recorded dialogue beyond Alvarenga's later interviews, and those accounts vary slightly in detail. What remains consistent is the outcome. Cordoba died at sea. The precise cause of death cannot be medically verified. Starvation, dehydration, infection, or a combination of factors are all plausible. There was no autopsy. No physical record remains. For several days after the death, Alvarenga kept the body in the skiff. He later stated that he spoke to it during that time. Eventually, decomposition made continued presence untenable. He pushed the body overboard. From that moment, the survival situation changed in structure. All tasks became singular responsibility: fishing, water collection, bailing during storms, maintaining balance during high swells. These now required uninterrupted effort from one person. Isolation intensified. With no companion, auditory silence became continuous. The sea produces sound, wind, water against hull, but no human voice. Extended solitary confinement is associated with perceptual distortion and emotional strain. Alvarenga later described periods of talking aloud and singing. Such behavior is consistent with documented coping mechanisms in prolonged isolation. Time tracking weakened further. Without shared counting or conversation, calendar reference dissolved. Months merged. Seasonal change at sea is subtle near the equator. Temperature variation is limited. The sun's path shifts gradually, but without instruments, it offers little orientation. Despite solitude, survival behaviors persisted. Fish continued to gather beneath the skiff. Rain continued intermittently. Turtles appeared unpredictably. Routine endured. The drift extended across open ocean with no witness. In late January 2014, more than 14 months after departure from Mexico, the drifting skiff approached land. Oceanographic analysis conducted after the event suggests that the vessel entered waters near the Marshall Islands after crossing approximately 6,000 miles of open Pacific. The currents that carried it westward eventually moved it toward the low coral atolls scattered across the Central Ocean. On January 30, 2014, the boat grounded on a reef near Eben Atoll, one of the southernmost islands in the Marshall Islands chain. Residents of the atoll observed the skiff near shore. Accounts from local islanders describe a man with long hair and beard emerging from the vessel. He was barefoot, his clothing was deteriorated, he spoke Spanish. The community on Eben primarily speaks Marshallese, but some residents contacted authorities after recognizing that the arrival was unusual. Medical assessment conducted shortly after rescue indicated that Alvarenga was dehydrated but stable. He was able to walk. He did not exhibit immediate signs of organ failure. His weight was reduced, but he was not in critical condition. He was transferred from Eben Atoll to Majuro, the capital of the Marshall Islands, for further evaluation. News of the rescue spread quickly. Verification required coordination between Marshallese authorities and officials in Mexico and El Salvador. Skepticism initially surrounded the claim of 438 days at sea. However, drift modeling by oceanographers supported the plausibility of a westward crossing from the Mexican coast to the Central Pacific within that time frame. The skiff itself bore marine growth consistent with extended exposure. The drift had ended not through navigation, but through current. José Salvador Alvarenga departed Mexico on November 17, 2012. He reached the Marshall Islands on January 30, 2014. The span between those dates measures 438 days. Oceanographers later confirmed that prevailing currents made such a crossing possible. The route aligned with the westward flow of the North Equatorial Current. No verified modern case documents a longer confirmed survival adrift at sea in a small, open vessel. His account was examined by medical professionals, journalists, and maritime researchers. While some details rely solely on his testimony, the physical evidence, the boat, the marine growth, the drift analysis, supported the duration. The Pacific did not alter its movement during those months. It followed established patterns. Wind, sun, and rain continued without awareness of the skiff moving across its surface. Survival in this case was not the result of conquest over the ocean. It was the result of adaptation within it. A small fiberglass boat crossed an ocean without direction. It arrived because the current allowed it to. Silence followed.